and welcome to our blog. And today I'm with Matthew Vernon Whalan. He's an independent journalist and oral historian who has focused on the deep structural crises within the prison system for over 15 years. Whalan is a qualitative researcher. That's a fancy term for actually listens to people and doesn't just rely on numbers. Rather than just dealing in statistics, he does a lot of oral history reporting and drawing out the contradictions and neglected systemic experiences in his work. He is the author of Doing Time, American Mass Imprisonment Pandemic, and most recently in our subject of discussion today, Bullock Chronicles of Deprivation and Despair and the American Prison, which came out in 2025 from that press that also did Settlers that I can't say. Kersplebedeb or whatever. He has written for, the normal leftist and progressive fare, but I'll throw them out just in case you want to look them up. Counterpunch, Jacobin, New York Journal of Books, but he's also written for such publications as the Alabama Political Reporter and the Brattleboro Reformer, which means I take them a little bit seriously, as he actually does local journalism. And I first became aware of him through our mutual friend, Ben Burgess. Ben and I disagree on many things, but we both care about prison reform. Or in my case,
oh, I lost you.
Idiosyncratic position on the left that corporal punishment is way more humane than prison. I'd much rather be whipped than go to jail for 5 years. Now, that's a long introduction, but I wanted to get it all out in the open. We are mostly focusing on your book, Bollocks, which is about a prison in, I believe, Alabama, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a former corrections officer in Georgia, a nearby state with similar problems, although less private prisons, which is interesting.
No private prisons in Alabama.
Yeah, I know. Everyone always focuses on the private prisons, and I'm like, they all suck, though.
Like, and everything in the state ones is privatized, so it's like not a huge difference,
Right. But to give a little bit of my background before I get into this, I was a corrections officer for only about a year because my mother helped me get the job. She was a prison psych nurse, which is an interesting thing to be. She came from she was a waitress until she was 40. So this is to give you where she came from. And she got into the prisons because she thought she'd be able to help inmates. She did not continue thinking that for very long and left after 3 years. And I worked at a medium security prison for about 9 months in college as she was leaving. And I alternated between being a floor and a tower guard. You know what that is. So
yeah.
And I can tell you this, even before I was a leftist, when I left that work, I was already like, no, we shouldn't send people to prisons for very much. In fact, I'm serious, and even when I was in my early 20s, I'm serious when I say I'd much rather. I think beating the shit out of people is more humane.
What prison were you in, by the way?
It's in Milledgeville.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and when you say you're working on the floor, is in Georgia, is the prison you were working in, is it like an open dorm, or are there cells, or what was it like there?
It had both. Yeah. Open dorm and cells depending on where you're at. I was at Baldwin State, so So it was interesting. I was hoping, actually, when I applied, to be put at the medical prison, just because that's where my family worked. But is a thoroughly unfortunate experience, Matthew. um, but anyway, so uh, what got you interested in writing so much about prisons? I mean, that has been the mainstay of your advocacy in journalism now for a long time.
Yeah, I started at a pretty young age, mostly focusing on a death row case that a family member had worked on pro bono in retirement, who had been a patent lawyer.
Mhm.
And I came across the case file, and I read I read the whole thing, as much of it as I could, and I started corresponding with a death row prisoner who I'm still in touch with. Actually, my next book is a short book about him, which Ben is writing the introduction for. Um, but in between, I have, I started to branch out to more prisons and also covering communities too, like how mass incarceration impacts families and, friends, former employers, churches, things like that. So that was in the late 20 teens, I guess. I had covered homelessness for a while and then went back to covering prisons more broadly than than just focusing on the death penalty. And while I was doing that, the pandemic broke out, and so all the problems I was interviewing the prisoners about in particular became a lot more urgent. The pandemic was really bad in Alabama, and all of the sanitary, plumbing, overcrowding issues, every problem with the living conditions almost was made worse by the pandemic in a situation that was already really bad. For people who don't know, another reason I focus on Alabama, aside from just having happened to stumble across it, is that Alabama is particularly bad, which is saying a lot for this country. So Alabama has it's about consistently like 170 to 180% of capacity. So it's 70 to 80% overcrowded at any given time. It has a massive drug dealing operation that is run by the officers, drug dealing and other contraband. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, it is essentially a drug cartel. Um, it has the highest suicide rates of any prison system in the country, the highest homicide rates, and the highest overdose rates. And it has gotten really bad. So in the 70s, there was litigation against the prison system in the federal courts, and the violence, the problems that were taking place in the prisons were seen as like particularly scandalous then. And one of the years, I think it was 74 to 5, that spurred some of that litigation, and drew more pressure to the litigation that was already taking place. There were 27 deaths that year, and now like every single year we're seeing over 200, over 300, over 400 deaths. So we've gone backwards by uh, it's gotten worse by hundreds of deaths a year since the 70s. So yeah, conditions are really bad there, and I got interested in it at an early age, and um, yeah, as I continued doing it, I just continued doing it, and it's gotten worse, significantly worse, starting right around the time I stumbled across it.
Yeah. So, uh, one thing I looked up for this interview was what the suicide rates were, because they were really bad in Georgia too. Alabama's abysmal. So for those of you
Right.
who
The two what?
the suicide rates, so
Let's
I was looking at in Georgia too.
Yeah.
Um, Alabama's abysmal. It's 80 deaths per 100,000. That's like over 10 times the national homicide rate. And Georgia's really bad. I mean, and because it's at 40 deaths per 100,000, and that's at double the national average. So if you think about Georgia being double the national average and Alabama being double that, and then think also about who is in these prisons, you are talking about some of the poorest people of a variety of demographics, including white, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
but also Black inmates, Latin inmates, not as many indigenous inmates because just the demographics of the region, but it is very, very bad. And to even put it in another perspective, a super reactionary state like Florida still only averages about 20 suicide deaths per 100,000. So,
right. And Alabama, according to Prison Policy Initiative, Alabama imprisons more of its population than any democratic nation on earth.
yeah.
And I mean, I always say, like, I'm skeptical of how any institution is defining what a democratic nation is, but nonetheless, like, that's a pretty staggering number. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to remind people, even though there's been a narrative that is loosely true, that in a lot of the larger states in the country, such as New York and California, there has been significant sentencing reform, and you've seen a decline in prison populations. That's not true in most of the South still. And even with that, we are still, as a society, right, the society that imprisons both in relative and absolute numbers more of its members than any society on earth, including the Gulag system in the USSR that every liberal makes so much hay about. I mean, it is nuts how many people we have in prison. So, and it's also something that is weirdly, it's not that leftists don't talk about it, but you think we talk about it more, given how much it affects the general population. Because I mean, like, I think it's 1 in 5 chance that you have someone in your life that has a direct relationship to the prison system in the United States, in a significant manner, like is on probation, parole, in prison, are could be very easily. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought up the court case. You specifically talk about 1976 is Pugh versus Locke in your book. And as you just said, the conditions are worse now. You also point out, though, that the Alabama Department of Corrections, which I'll just call ADOC from this point on, has not actually fixed the old prison problems at all, but has instead decided to lean into building new prisons and not tackle any sentencing or parole reform, as has happened in some of the larger states. Why do you think that is?
Well, I always say, like, I'm skeptical to speculate. It's partly because I don't live there. I'm skeptical to speculate on people's motives. I mean, I think it does seem like you know, it's from people I talk to down there, from other journalists I talk to, it does seem like a sort of cultural and, you know, cultural political fixture. I mean, listen, like, there's money to be made, you know, and there's a lot of money to be made, and if you're a sort of cynical capitalist, I guess, not only do you have, like, a captive labor force, but you also have, like, captive customers, you know, because if you don't like the phone system, for example, like, too bad, you can't get another plan. There's no quality control for anything they buy. It's like the most they can get away with charging for the shittiest product. Sorry, I don't know if I can swear on here,
You
but
can swear as much as you want.
awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, and um, so yeah, I mean, like I was saying before, you were saying before, they're state prisons, but everything in them is privatized. The phone system is privatized, the food is privatized, the construction, the medical care, you name it. So, um, and so yeah, I mean, in terms of, yeah, like I don't know, I can't like read into like the voters' heart too much about like why this continues, but I do think that there is a, there's a sort of a culture where you can score political points by um treating people like uh like a monster, and there's money to be made, you know. um I don't know if I have like a whole lot of a more interesting answer than that. The other thing I would say, two more things. One is that, like, you know, we we kind of let this happen, like you said, like, it is interesting that like more people don't care about this more, especially on the left. I thought even at the time that, like, and because I was reporting on it so heavily, it seemed to me, and prisoners, told me in interviews that they felt sort of like left out of the Black Lives Matter movement in the early 2020s, which because it focused so heavily on policing, which is obviously really important. But they were surprised, and I was surprised that like mass incarceration was not more of a focus of that protest movement.
Mhm.
And then the last thing I would say is just that uh, I forgot my last thought. It'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I noticed when I was living in Georgia, and this is hard for people to gather, is that in most of the southern states in particular, inmates can't vote, but also former felons can't vote. Some of that's been mitigated through ballot referendums, but in most of the southern states, it still stands. However, interestingly, you can count prison populations for how you adjudicate a, a congressional representation and congressional appointment. So even though those people cannot vote and will not, in many states, ever be able to after they are released, they count as a population for um, local politicians. So I agree with you that there is a lot of cruelty. I also suspect, and this is coming from someone who did live in Georgia that never lived in Alabama, but they were my neighbors. That uh, the psychology here is when you hear about one horrible thing, you respond to that one horrible thing, but you don't think about the systemic cost of the horrible thing. Because I will admit that one of the most amazing things to me that I was thinking about when reading your book is how invisible this is to most people, even though most of us are one step removed from somebody who has ties or is in this system.
Mhm.
Um, and so we all know people who've been in and out of prison for the most part, and yet
Yeah.
we don't really understand the system. Like, I think people are often shocked to hear about what conditions are, how these things work, what happens in there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also surprised that like I don't get more pushback from like conservatives. I mean, in some ways I'm not surprised because like, like you were saying earlier, like it really does like just wrap up a ton of poor people. And in Alabama, most people are, many people are Republicans, so their kids are in there too. And so, a lot of people like follow my work and stuff who have very different politics from me. Because like they're affected by it. So I don't also like I don't want to, this was the thought I lost before. Like I don't want to diminish like how much opposition and resistance there is, even among like people who maybe don't necessarily share my politics more broadly. There's definitely common ground on this in some instances because, um, it really does affect everybody. And also, like, tough on crime conservatives, like, are not going to be okay in some instances with like massive drug dealing operations going on inside their government. Ideally, if they're consistent, you know.
Yeah.
So like you do find people who are sort of consistent about their politics in a way that you land on common ground on this issue sometimes.
Yeah, this is another one. This one and or issues around like imperial expansion are an area that in aggregate it may cut slightly the way the narrative thinks. So there's more progressives that care about it than conservatives. However, it doesn't cut on individual ideological lines. And to make that point, my stance on prisons has not changed from when I was a right winger to now. Like it is pretty much identical.
Yeah.
They suck. They're not helpful. I think they make people worse in every way. Like,
Yes.
So, and I want to get into that because there are stories in your book on Bollocks that really hit home to me. I mean, one it comes up very early is what happened with Derek, who is in a prison block that is almost double capacity and is afflicted with
Number of things. Yeah.
hepatitis C, HIV, and seizures from getting his brain bashed in, basically in prison.
Yeah.
And I was totally not surprised by this. But there's a total lack of mental health support, because the other thing is like auxiliary services and stuff, such as what my mom actually did in the prison, which was, like I said, she was a psych nurse. That stuff has been cut down. It still exists, but it's been cut down over the past 2 decades. Ironically, not saving anyone any money. If you actually look at the cost of imprisoning someone, it's astronomical.
Yes.
But they have been
break and don't fix them, which ends up costing money too, I think, you know.
Yeah. And you point out kind of two things that are going to come up a lot. One is there are ways, because these people are prisoners, that they can get around stuff like privacy access to discourage treatment. So, for example, Derek has HIV, but there are newsletters that display the names of everyone who goes to the clinic.
Yeah.
So everyone knows who has HIV. And then you also talked about in the first chapter how many guards are smuggling in narcotics, including fentanyl, but also let's see,
Ice, Flocka.
Yeah.
Prison.
For those of you who don't know your narcotics, all that shit's bad.
Yeah. Spice,
So,
one that makes people really lose their minds, like.
Yeah. And I can tell you this as a former corrections officer, it's not all of them, but it's so many of them that it's really hard to say it's not systemic, because the only way that stuff is getting in, despite what you might see from like movies about like visitors bring it in, is through the corrections officers. That's how it gets in.
And you know this, I mean, like during the pandemic. So like during the pandemic, first of all, the prisons were the last thing that Alabama announced they were going to close there for the lockdown. And then they were the last thing they announced they were going to open back up when the lockdown ended. And so we had a long period where, you know, literally no one was coming in and out except the people who worked there. It was closed to visitation during the pandemic, and overdose rates went up. So there's like quite literally no one else it could be, you know, on top of all the like witness accounts of this happening. I think that's pretty mind blowing. Overdose rates went up when the prison was on lockdown.
Yeah, that's something else.
Yeah.
Another thing you highlight, and I don't think people who haven't spent a lot of time in these prisons understand this, but the infrastructure shit at this point. Some
Yeah.
of them, if they were built a long time ago, they probably had decent infrastructure. They're built in like the 1940s or 50s, but they haven't been upkept anywhere. And if they're more modern, no.
Yeah. I mean, they have, like, this is the crazy thing is that, like, they're not, I mean, they're not that, a lot of them are not that old, and they're
Right.
just in such horrible shape. I mean, the oldest one is Kilby. Kilby's opened in the 1930s um, after essentially, like, convict leasing in that iteration ends, and they start sending everyone to prison instead of the coal mines. And Kilby's in really bad shape. I mean, the other thing that's so crazy about the fact that the only thing they're willing to do to address overcrowding is building more prisons. The thing that's so crazy about that is that they have to close several prisons at the same time because they're in such horrible shape. So, like, either those, it won't address the overcrowding because they're closing other prisons at the same time, or that means they're gonna leave those dilapidated hellholes open because they're claiming they still don't have enough beds. So it's like, you know, they've chosen this solution that's kind of like a lose-lose for people who are, anti-prison. Um,
Yeah, I mean this is actually something you talk about too. The infrastructure is terrible, and like you give examples of this. For example, you have backed up septic tanks with where the kitchen was placed directly over the septic system, which not only makes the kitchen smell like sewage gas, but also is a major health hazard.
yeah.
And when I remind people that we're not generally talking about um just people who have done violent crime. And again, I'm not even sure that all the violent crime would deserve what this gets. But like, a lot of these people are drug offenders and relatively minor ones because uh one of the easiest ways in the South to go to prison for drugs is to not have anyone to turn over. And so oddly, the less implicated you are in the illicit drug trade, the harder it is to trade anything to get a better plea bargain. So ironically and sadly, it means that some of the people with tougher sentences are people who really are in the low end of the supply chain in the illicit drug market.
Mhm.
And I've always told that to people to be like, these aren't the people you think you are. Yeah, when I was in prisons, you would encounter murderers, and every now and then you'd learn about some shit that would like give you nightmares. But also, that was rare enough that I can think of 4 times where that happened. And then also when I was in corrections, the one thing I would try to do is never learn why people were in prison so that I would treat them pretty much all consistently.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I try to do that in the writing too, like, just focus on the living conditions and avoid cases for similar reasons.
yeah, because um, uh, I don't want to create, I never wanted to create a scenario where it'd be like, oh, well, they deserved it. And I'm like, I'm not making that call. I mean, there's people who deserve all kinds of shit, but like,
Yeah, yeah.
um, so, uh,
Yeah, just quickly, like, Derek, for example,
mm,
just on your point, like, he was in there for all nonviolent charges, on all nonviolent drug charges, and I think 1 or 2 cases of check fraud. He was in there for over 20 years in a dorm with people who, like, kidnapped people and raped people and stuff, like, uh, it's insane, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, from his injuries from prison, he was also very vulnerable to aggression. And the one thing I will say that, you know, a lot of the prison propaganda movies actually are fairly honest about is the tribal nature of a lot of prison systems. And if you don't have um uh alliances, usually which are coded racially, you are kind of a sitting duck. That's true. That's not just a myth.
Yeah.
Um but you know, one of the things that I was thinking about reading your book, uh uh I was thinking about a lot of these prisoners that you talk to. I mean, there's Derek, there's Nick, there's Cecile. Um and how much worse they would be when they get out for trying to integrate into society, and how likely they would have to go back. It just didn't, it couldn't leave me, because I that was my immediate thought. I was like, oh, if this works so well, why does everyone who go into it pretty much uh not have that many options? That isn't the focus of your book, but the conditions that you go through in these prisons are bad enough that it is kind of hard to reintegrate into society. Uh, and a lot of people, as your story indicates, are more drug addicted and now have had to rely on violence more, or accept help from more violent actors in the prison to stay afloat. Um, it is, you know, even from a kind of conservative morality standpoint, morally corrupting.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I think, you know, it likely makes people worse. And I mean, I have interviewed people who, you know, in post release, you know, I've had a couple of people who did pretty well, but you know, a lot of them, like, I lose touch with after they get out, and a lot of them go back. I mean, most of them describe like what's I mean, I'm not a clinician, but a lot of them describe, like, what seems to me like pretty textbook PTSD, you know, very, jumpy, nightmares, getting freaked out when people, like, come into their space when they're in the house, you know, um, and they describe it being like a war zone, you know, you know, I interviewed a guy many years ago who had been in for just like 3 years, and he said, like, he felt like he was in a war zone, you know, he was in Ventress prison, and, yeah, you're right, there's just a lot of, ways in which not only does, like, in it punish you in cruel and unusual ways, but then, like, it sets you up for failure with no help when you get out unless you're lucky, you know?
Right, yeah.
And they don't let I mean, the parole board denies over 80%, so which is crazy high, even compared to other states in the US.
Yeah, and you know, it's not like Alabama's ever been known for its economy either.
Yeah.
Um, um, I want to get into some of these specific stories a little bit. We talked a little about Derek, but uh, I want to talk about Cecile, because uh, Cecile really makes it clear how a lot of these like uh trying children or young people as adults and throwing them into adult prison is super destructive. And uh one that kind of baffles me that it caught on. I mean, I remember when the movement to, you know, if you did the crime, you do the time regardless of your age. And I was like, yeah, but why does that mean that you put them into an adult prison? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
um well, because it's cheaper. But Cecile's narrative really makes it clear, um how damaging it is to transfer these people directly into an adult matter maximum security prison. And I wanted to ask you, from your interactions with Cecile, how do you think surviving the trauma of growing up in an adult prison effectively warps a psychology and how they might understand the outside world, like to type it back into this trauma stuff? What narratively, we're not going to diagnose anybody, but what narratively did you see?
That's a great question. I mean, this is one of the more like heartbreaking aspects of this work. I mean, yeah, it completely like takes away your adulthood. I mean, a lot of the prisoners I interview, they're very smart in like a very self-educated way, because there are not a lot of educational resources in the prisons. There's some programs and stuff, trade programs and things like that, but like I know a lot of people who, essentially like more or less taught themselves to read and stuff like that, so they're very smart, but you can see how um, limited the outlook on the world is. And there's a very sort of young, like earnestness to a lot of these conversations. But yeah, I mean, like yeah, that is, I don't know how else to put it. Like that is one of like the most crushing aspects of this work, is to just see how many like it's like what we're doing to children, you know? I mean, I have another source who's not in the book. His name's Milton Jones. I have written about his case, and that's that's all out there. It's on my Substack and stuff. But just to give you like one example, this guy was convicted at 15 for a crime he claims he didn't commit, and I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to me like he at least has a strong case for innocence, I certainly can't find evidence that he did it. But he was convicted as an adult at 15. He had no parents. He could not read or write. He had an all-white jury. He was convicted partly on the basis of, quote, 2 negroid pubic hairs, similar to those of the known suspect, unquote. That's negroid with a capital N, which I had never seen in a court case file before, even in Alabama. Like even by Alabama standards, that was pretty shocking. His mother was a child prostitute who was not in the state at the time. She had him when she was 15. He never knew his father. The people he claims did commit this crime and who he hung around with at that time were all like 15 years older than him or more. So these are like full-blown adults. The saddest part of that story is that that was in 1982 and he's still in there. So it's been 44 years. And it's just like a complete incoherence to this, like I've interviewed adults who were charged with rape and didn't get that much time, uh, and they were adults when they committed those crimes too. So yeah, I mean, like that's just one example. Cecile is another example. And yeah, I mean, there's this tens of thousands of children at any given time are held in adult facilities, and every state, I believe, still every state, under some circumstances, at least allows for children to be convicted as adults.
Yeah. You also bring up transgender issues in this, which I think people would be surprised is more prevalent in the prison system than people than people think, given the misguided conception that people often have that trans people are usually upper middle class. And I have no idea why people have that, except that for like famous cases, because it's definitely not generally the case. But you talk about this a lot because both HIV, which is still a more live issue in the prisons than it seems to be out here, although people should note it is coming back. As a person who lived through, this is only vaguely related, as a person who lived through, AIDS as being understood scientifically, and my first memories of it, it was barely out of being called gay cancer. Because I'm older than I look. It's wild to me how not serious we take this sometimes. But it's still a major issue in the prisons. And you talk about how social ostracism, even amongst inmates, between both the HIV infected and the transgender, is like ubiquitous, and there's no real attempt to mitigate it or have any alternative system for it at all. So would you like to talk about what you saw around that?
Yeah, I mean, also treatment of gay prisoners is really
bad.
Yeah,
it's really bad.
People can get like kidnapped within the prison by other prisoners. They call it getting claimed. Where if you are someone, often it's like, they prey on like people who are more shy, or like you said earlier, like for whatever reason don't have certain kinds of protection. And like you will be like claimed, and then like you basically become like kidnapped, and often are essentially just like a sex slave. And the only way often to get out of that is for someone else to take you away, who you then owe as well. So yeah, there's all kinds of like discrimination. They're not allowed in certain areas. They're not allowed to. Gay and trans prisoners are not allowed to, like barter certain items the way that other prisoners will with each other. They, yeah, and because this, like, people don't want like food off of their trays because they don't want anything that was touched. They're not allowed in like the ice chest area. So there's even some tension around like where they can stand in relation to other people in certain situations. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really brutal. I mean, Cecile is pretty tough, and I think she does have some solid alliances in there. But yeah, with Derek, and then there's another one, I think it's Zach, who just are just like going through hell in there, for a lot of the time. And yeah, so yeah, that's a huge theme. I mean, there's also just like straight people who are targeted in a sexual way as well. So yeah, sexual violence is a huge problem. Yeah, and like people preying on people who are perceived to be weaker is also a huge problem.
Yeah. Well, it just goes back to that war zone effect. I'll be frank with you. Having I've done many things to earn my PTSD diagnosis, but
Yes.
the worst of them, and stuff that still gives me nightmares, even more than the stuff I saw in Egypt and Mexico, is stuff I saw in the prison. I'm not like
Yeah.
it's it was hard, and it was hard. I mean, like, not to. I mean, there's a temptation when you live through something like that to think that the only way something like that can happen is that people deserve it, which
Yeah.
perpetuates the whole cycle. And I would kind of judge the character of other corrections officers about how they thought about that. I mean, you know, also if they were smugglers and like, yeah, I knew of Watts. It's to me, this is where I get kind of disgusted, because this is such a known problem that we don't talk about. Like, it's in like every fucking TV show that's on a police procedural kind of admits this stuff, both on the sexual violence and on the massive level of drug trafficking. They all know it's happening.
Yeah.
But it's treated as a natural consequence of prison, but as if the people deserve it because they're in prison. And when I think about what lands people in prison, which is normally, I don't have a good enough lawyer to get my sentence reduced, or I don't have a good enough lawyer to get me a better plea deal.
Yeah. That's the,
it is shockingly bad. And you know, I've lived in many countries, and I've, you know, some of those countries have terrifying prison systems. Mexico being one of them. But at the same time, I was also surprised that for example, political prisons in Egypt can be pretty notoriously awful, but they actually still allowed more freedom of movement and whatnot internally than a lot of U.S. prisons. And the thing about the U.S. prisons is, while freedom of movement is often formally restricted, they're so overcrowded with those dorms that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And that's something that is wild to me.
Yes, they hardly let any people. They hardly even let people outside.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
One thing that I found interesting in Alabama that I didn't see as much of, and this was more than 20 years ago. I guess this was 25 years ago for me. So I know things have significantly changed since 2001. But you talked about the dorm web system a lot, and I wanted to get into that because there are several court rulings that hold that prisoners can't hold positions of authority over inmates because of a variety of reasons, including increased cruelty, you know, capo-like tactics, that sort of thing. But that a lot of these prisons in the South rely on dorm reps, because they don't have enough corrections officers for guard supervision. And they often end up being first responders for pretty much every damn thing, but for medical emergencies, custodial shifts, etc. And since they have no resources, and I can say this as a person who's actually been in a similar thing as a child, where you don't have any resources and you're like, well, I don't know what to do, so I'm just gonna threaten violence. They often have to make violent threats or even perpetuate violence, partly out of desperation to answer the situations that they're put in. How much of this did you see? I mean, you document a lot of it in this book, but like, what are the costs? What are the costs to the system for that? What are the costs to the individual inmates? Why has this gotten so profound in Alabama?
The dorm reps in particular.
Yeah. And like, for having prisoners try to handle this themselves with no resources.
Well, this goes back a long way. It's sort of tied up with the history of slavery in Alabama, with the history of forced labor, whatever you want to call it. I mean, if you look up through the 70s, when federal litigation, that actually the court orders that the 13 court orders that were laid out in that case, one of them is the one you named, about how prisoners are not allowed to be in positions of authority over other prisoners. You know, right before those court cases, there was an oral history book by a guy named Ray March, who I believe was a California journalist, who wrote a oral history about Alabama prisons in the 70s by covering I think it's three or four generations of anyway, it's I think it's a grandfather who was a warden, a son who was a warden, and then a grandson who became a probation officer. But one of the things you'll notice in that book is that like the prisoners used to be like a huge part of these people's lives, like up through like pretty like later than you'd think in the 20th century. Like for example, like prisoners would be allowed like out pretty liberally. There were some instances where like women were even allowed through a back door to like visit. Are multiple instances of prisoners like babysitting the warden's children, like outside of the prison. And then like if the child did something it wasn't supposed to do or got hurt or something, the prisoner would get like punished and whipped instead of the kid. So um yeah, like there is a sort of cultural theme here at play where the forced labor has at certain points like um like been put that has landed prisoners in positions of all kinds of authority and intertwined even in people's lives. And also you mentioned earlier that Alabama is not a very wealthy state, and yet there is an insistence in the culture there on having this huge costly prison system. So therefore Alabama has been sort of incentivized to support itself, for the prison system in Alabama to have to support itself. And obviously the cheapest way to do that is free labor. Um, and so yeah, I mean, I would argue that if you don't mind me going on a bit of a
Go ahead.
in here, basically in after the Civil War, Alabama essentially like continued practicing slavery through debt bondage and convict leasing, etc. Um, and in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a Justice Department prosecutor named Warren Reese who actually was like a fairly conservative person. Like, this was not a liberal or a flaming leftist. I think his grandfather had, I can't remember if his grandfather or his father fought on the side of the Confederacy in the Civil War. But the Justice Department starts getting these tips of slavery taking place. So this prosecutor goes to Alabama, investigates. Sure enough, he finds that there's like this debt bondage, convict leasing going on in Alabama post Civil War. So he starts prosecuting these cases, and he starts winning. But pretty quickly, one of the first people who was convicted of it realized that he could just plead guilty and pay like $1,000 fine for the cost of doing business, and go on his way and keep practicing it. And so Warren Reese hit this wall where like after that was figured out, people just kept taking the fine and pleading guilty. Um, so that goes on, and it doesn't really get addressed until FDR. By that time, the last iteration of this is probably the most famous one, which is chain gangs. And that ends under FDR, largely in an effort to tighten up our propaganda as we were, preparing for war. But and then I would argue that after that practice ends, that's when people are taken from the coal mines and sent to Kilby in the 1930s. And after that practice ends, I would argue like the forced labor in Alabama has just taken on a new iteration where instead of it being just leased out to business tycoons, which is happening through the work release program. But much more of the focus now is just on prisoners maintaining the prison itself. So so the forced labor has been kind of refocused on that, with the exception of the work release program, which is extremely corrupt. I mean, they're denying people at all-time rates, and those people are not getting paid. So, and the ones that are getting paid are making almost nothing.
Yeah.
So
I mean, most states still follow the guidance, unfortunately, snuck into the 13th and 14th Amendments, which basically allows for slavery as long as it's for a crime, as opposed to, and you aren't individually owned, but owned by the state. This was a massive problem in Southern economies in the early 20th century for not just, inmates, and particularly Black inmates, but for all working class people in the South, because you had a conscript workforce that could be used and was used and loaned out back in the early 20th century to do all kinds of private labor. They still kind of are, but now it's in prison manufacturing more than anything else. I was going to ask you about that.
The maintenance, the cooking, the laundry, like all that shit is handled by prisoners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which does beg the question: why are prisons so damn expensive if they're also so cheaply run? Because it's still, like, for anyone who knows, a prisoner costs the state 5 to 7 times per year what a school student does. Easy that many times. So, like, the per pupil spending is, like, in the United States now is between like $8,000 and $12,000 on average, and like the per inmate spending is like $80,000 to $100,000 a year, and yet these conditions are as terrible as they are. So who's making that money, and what is it going to?
Yeah, well, a lot of it does go to the private companies that run things in the prisons, but also, like, I mean, I would say a few things. They do spend a lot of money on building new prisons, and they try to do that whenever they can. They've even diverted COVID relief funds to building new prisons at one point. There's a great journalist named Beth Shelburne, actually, pretty recently has done some really great work on this question. She wrote a series called Following the Money. Another huge cost for the Department of Corrections is legal fees. They cover the legal fees of the guards who participate in this stuff. So there are instances even of, like, guards who didn't know that, like, they had cases that were settled. Like, they just so the number she found, largely through open records requests and things like that, was the Alabama Department of Corrections has spent like $50 million in 5 years on legal fees to protect their like criminal workforce. So yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of it. The other thing is, like, I mean, I guess I don't know. I'm not the most, like, fiscally responsible human being, but I guess there are, like, a couple of ways to save money with an operation like this. One is to, like, fix things early when they break, so that they don't become more expensive problems later. Another way to save money is to just accept that, like, you're not going to ever fix them at all, no matter how bad they get, and that's really, I think, the route that Alabama takes. But I do think that results in breakdowns that end up eventually being, like, really expensive, and then also I would say that, like, these companies are the companies that make money off this stuff. They're often bidding on contracts. I imagine they have donor-based relationships to politicians who allow this to continue. The construction companies, the phone companies. I mean, like, I'll put it this way. Like, at one point several years ago, there was some push to get the Alabama Department of Corrections to slightly reduce the cost of prison phone calls, and like the Alabama government refused. And it's crazy because like they don't see any of that money. It's a private company. It's not like they're it's not like that comes back in taxes to the state. Like it literally doesn't affect Alabama at all how much like these in terms of tax revenue. It doesn't affect them at all how much these phone calls cost. Like it's not like the state is losing money if they lower those phone calls. It's just like they're just protecting this company, this company's ability to overcharge for no reason, like for no and so I think they're just like friendly with these kinds of like I think these people are kind of all in bed together, I guess is a way to put it. And so like they get overpaid for doing a shitty job because like no one cares. And yeah, I mean they're kind of parasitic, right? Like they're just like using the government to get massive amounts of money and contracts to build these like really poorly operating hellholes. I mean, there's this common thing in Bullock. It's a huge theme, but I've interviewed prisoners and throughout the state. I've even gotten I've managed to get video footage of this from the inside in a story about Fountain Prison, aptly named for the story I'm about to tell, which is that like every time it rains in Alabama, like these prisons just flood with raw sewage. Like throughout the dorms, you mentioned earlier in the kitchen, like this is a problem in multiple prisons. And so the plumbing is just a disaster. The plumbing issues are a disaster. And I think, there's three reasons for that. Like one is that they are extremely poorly built. They're often built on really cheap, swampy land. Another reason is that prisoners only get one roll of toilet paper per week, and it's destruction of state property to like tear up your shirt or anything. So to hide the fact that they're doing that, they'll cut it up and flush it down the toilet when they run out of toilet paper. So I've interviewed guys who have unclogged the plumbing system with their bare hands because they were denied any supplies or outside help. And they just talk about like all the different kinds of stuff they're pulling out of the toilets, shirts, sheets. One guy talked about finding a pipe in there, like just all kinds of stuff. And then, like I said before, they just have decided that like they're not going to fix these things, and I don't even, at this point, I don't even know how fixable it is or if like the damage is just done. But yeah. So like, yeah, it just speaks to like the amount of money that's being made off of this, really poorly designed system. I think just tells us something about like the relationships that these companies have to our governments, in this country. They're getting, let's say, overpaid for this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think people. One of the things that I have actually tried to get the left to care about, from education to prisons, and we talk about it today, but is the amount of cost disease that we get that turns people against trying to fix this stuff, which is actually from administrative corruption and administrative bloat. Some of it is in the school system. It's more bloat than corruption, although corruption has happened. And it's necessary bloat because of all the documentation that needs to happen and the various competing agencies that are involved. But when it comes to the prisons, it's not really, they're not documented shit. This is more just straight up. We're paying for private administration that is incentivized not to do a damn thing. And whether those are private prisons or not. And I think your point about here is really important, because there's been a lot of focus on the left against private prisons, private prison industrial complex. And yet I'm like, but effectively, as you've said and as I've said, public prisons are private too. It just because they are technically administrated by the state, which many southern states are, Georgia and Alabama both are. Everything within the prison is still subcontracted out, and there is no concern over quality control. And surprisingly, there's very little concern over actually addressing cost sinks.
Yeah.
So, to me, this has always been. I don't think it is an accident that the decline of the population in productive factory jobs, which I sadly hate to tell people aren't coming back in the same way, so we have to figure out another way to handle this. But I don't think it is an accident that the explosion of the prison system corresponds with first the underdevelopment of particularly the poor Black areas of the Southeast, and then the destruction of the industrial heartland in places like St. Louis and Chicago and all kinds of places. I mean, we just go through the Midwest, and that these two things mean that we have a bunch of to use an unfortunate term from Marxism, but it is apt here, surplus population that we are handling carcerally. And there are changes here. So, for example, I think drug problems now affect enough middle-class people that they're not using drugs as the excuse anymore. What we are increasingly seeing is just the outright making homelessness illegal, so we can use that as a pretext. So I'm pretty dim on this getting fixed for a variety of reasons, because people are scared of crime, rightly or wrongly. And despite the fact this system is incredibly expensive and so many people are implicated in it, it also seems to me that there's so much of a industry here, both depending on the prison and the state, both in actually doing industrial production, which I don't think people know, but I think something like 20% of all goods in the United States have some component of prison labor in their finishing process. I can't remember the exact statistics, so people couldn't find it, but it's way higher than you think it is. And then there's also all this rent seeking that you're talking about for very, very subpar results. And what we've learned, I mean, every criminologist that I've ever known, and I'm not just talking about bleeding heart liberal ones, will tell you that shitty prison conditions exacerbate recidivism. They don't reduce it.
Also, even fairly conservative criminologists will tell you that mass incarceration in particular, when you do it on a scale like this, at the very least, it's highly subject to the law of diminishing returns as a means of fighting crime. It just does not have it just does not affect the crime rate the way that we want it to, the more we do it. No. And yeah, there are a variety of reasons for that. But yeah, sorry, continue. Yeah.
No. I mean, outside of very specific neighborhoods in rich urban areas, I don't know, Skid Row in LA, which are actually super dangerous. But LA itself is a very safe city, despite all the homelessness and all the other problems, which are very real. The states with the worst prisons are also the states that have the worst crime problems relative to their population.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, there's just there was, there's a great book on this called "Why Are So Many Americans in Prison?" It seems to be the biggest explanation is the increase in sentencing laws for violent crime. But when they published that book, there was beginning to be more research on what they call the criminogenic effect, which is like whether it's what you're describing, like whether prison makes people worse, and if so, like on what scale, you know. And that's that's something that I really want to look into more deeply. But as I was saying, like as a means of fighting crime, at the very least, it's highly subject to the law of diminishing returns, and there is some evidence that it even makes people worse. You know,
Yeah.
that it contributes to the recidivism rate. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, you got a population that even if they didn't have PTSD before, for the most part now does.
Yeah.
You have people who've now been exposed to the illicit drug trade in ways they probably actually weren't before they went into prison, into kinds and categories of drugs that they probably weren't as much before they went into prison. I mean, you know,
I mean, this is anecdotal, but like it is amazing how many people I've interviewed who I say in the book, like I've interviewed a lot of guys who are in there for all violent crimes, then got to prison and started doing drugs. And I also interviewed a lot of guys who were in there for drug crimes that then got to prison and did something violent. You know, like it's just like system failure in every possible way, you know.
Right.
By every metric. Yeah. It's just
I also find it hilarious, to be quite honest with you, that like even Western conservatives and liberals will realize that like this was a problem in Russia that led to the creation of a whole lot of what we now might call the Russian mob, but is really kind of various cartels and illicit trades that would not have existed without the Russian prison system.
Yeah.
And so they pointed out with the Soviet Union and with the early Russian Federation. But I'm like, what is that? Can you not see that has the implications for us, since we have way more of a percentage of our population in the prison system for a variety of reasons? And while, like I said, there has been some reversal of these trends, it's mostly limited to blue states. And it's mostly limited to big blue states. So we're talking about reversal of trends in New York and California. Partly, and I really do believe this, it wasn't out of the kindness of their progressive heart so much as the state needed to really save some money and rein in some of these expenses.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
California.
Yeah, in California and in New York. Yeah.
Actually, that book I was talking about, like at the same time that California started to reduce its prison population, Italy also did. But they had different results. Like in California, it didn't really raise the crime rate at all. In Italy, people noticed it did. And the explanation in the research for that is that like California had been doing this so much longer that like Italy's system became overcrowded pretty quickly, and then it was addressed in the same year that California's was. But California had been overcrowded for a really long time. So you're not like releasing as many people who just got in there a couple years ago after they did something great. Like there's more like older people to release. There's more disabled people to release. There are more there are people who have been in there longer to release. There more people in there for lesser sentences and things like that. So yeah, it just speaks to that theory of like overpopulated prisons being subject to the law of diminishing returns. Like over time, they basically do not lower, even if you're being charitable, you know, over time, they do not lower the crime rate at all. And there's some reason to believe that they might play into the recidivism rate. But that's sort of the explanation in that comparison, is that like Italy didn't experience that the same way because they hadn't been doing it for so long. It was still having some returns for them.
Right.
Whether that's an ethical way to get those returns is a separate question, but
but there were returns. I mean, I think about this to get back to a little bit of what I was thinking though, with why just logically, I just think it seems obvious it would increase the recidivism rate. Highly PTSD, people who've now been exposed to kinds of criminality they probably weren't before. And then lastly, I have two close family members who have been in and out of the prison system. And what I can tell you is the kinds of work they can get afterwards is like stage rigging full of drugs, meat product print, which is people don't really realize, they read that the jungle happened and things got better in the 20s, and I'm like, no, meat processing is a god awful thing. There's so many people I met from meat packing in the South who were like lost fingers and were permanently disabled within a few months. And then the other things you tend to be able to do is gig work, which is actually, of the three, probably the least bad option. Because, and there are some fields where I understand this. Like, I get why teachers need a background check. I understand that. Like, but the amount of employment that is immediately closed off to anyone with a felony or even a significant misdemeanor, I don't know how this doesn't become a self-perpetuating system, because it's also very hard to get work in the fields, like I said, that you can get work in, are either precarious, dangerous, are already known to be rife for criminality anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a serious situation that I think we have to address. And I have been worried because there have been, they're not common, but you and I both seen stuff on like Turf on Crime Socialists come around. And I've been worried that, like, you're not dealing with the fact that even if you care about these crime issues, that there is no evidence that mass incarceration is doing anything about it, and you're not providing me with another program to handle these issues.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and also, like, I'll say this, like, research on alternative models is mixed as well. Like, but it's not like, it's roughly the same as like the outcome in terms of reducing crime. And like, like, I should say, like, I disagree with a lot of people on my side about, like, a lot of people who share my politics are a lot more optimistic about those, like, harm reduction type models than I am. But they're not producing a worse outcome than the prison system in terms of the crime
right.
rate, and like, if you care about crime, like, at the very least, a lot of those programs would be like a more moral and ethical way to deal with crime, so long as they're not resulting in, like, skyrocketing crime rates, which they don't seem to be. Uh,
Right.
uh,
Yeah. I also, this is funny that we agree on this. I also am a skeptic of harm reduction, and I am somewhat of a skeptic of restorative justice. So,
Same here. Yeah, that's really probably more what I'm thinking of in this context. Yeah, yeah.
but I am, I still, my, like I told you in the beginning, and I'm not joking. There's not a lot of studies on this because not many countries have mass corporal punishment, and I don't really want to live in Singapore.
Yeah.
But I even think there's some evidence that would be better, and at least more humane, despite it being in some ways inhumanly brutal. And so I want to be people clear. I'm actually not really advocating that we just start like giving ship lashes to people for minor crimes, but like, when I think about what I've seen prison do to some people, like, because I mean, reading your book on bollocks was a little bit hard because I've seen some of this stuff myself, and it's gotten so much worse than what I was dealing with in Georgia 25 years ago. But like, it is deeply triggering, and it's also not, the horror of the prisons is not adjudicated in a way that's like, oh, the most violent are the people who have the roughest time. That is not how that works.
Right.
And
one of the, just sorry to interrupt, but on that point, like, one of the biggest problems in Alabama, which you'll note when you read the book, is actually something that comes up in those 13 court orders that were never dealt with. Is one of those court order was for Alabama to create a sensible, some semblance of a sensible classification system. But because of the overcrowding, like, that's still a huge problem, arguably worse now. They have no classification system, essentially. So, I mean, with some exceptions, like, I do think that people who have life without parole maybe can't be in Bullock. Like, so there's like some cosmetic things like that. But like, every prison I've interviewed people in, I've interviewed both people who were convicted of nonviolent drug crimes and people who were convicted of violent crimes living in the same dorm. Right? Like, without exception, that is something I've interviewed both of those kinds of people in the same dorm in every prison I've covered, I think.
Yep.
So, like, just sorry to interrupt. I hope I didn't take
No, you did not. Although I also want to point out, the one kind of category of crime I didn't encounter a lot in prison was white collar crime.
Yeah, like, right. Yeah.
Like, you don't encounter a ton of it. Like, it's not to say never. I mean, like, if you were a massive embezzler, I think I met one. But like, in general, the system finds other ways to punish them, be they focusing on financial punishments, which a lot of those people can afford anyway, afford, as opposed to poor people can't, or putting them in very minimum security scenarios, even though their harm to society sometimes is arguably more than some of the, like, drug crime and moderate theft crimes that you
right. Point about the death penalty, but I think you can really apply it to the prison system more broadly. His famous line was like, the death penalty is not for the worst crime, it's for the worst lawyer. And I think that's pretty true across the board, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so where can people find your work, Matthew? You're continuing to do this kind of work. You've written 2 books now, but you are still out there trying to get this stuff out and reporting on other stories. So where can people want to find out more about, what inmates are going through and whatnot? Where would they go?
Yeah, you can. My book is on, anywhere you can buy a book. It's on my publisher's bookstore website, which is just leftwingbooks.net. It's on Amazon, anywhere if you prefer to buy from those dipshits. And I have a Substack called The Hard Times Reviewer, which primarily focuses on prison issues. And a lot of my articles are republished in Counterpunch magazine.
Cool. Yeah. I would check it out. You have the interesting distinction of being the first author on my show who also is on the same press as Jay Sakai. So
sure. Yeah.
If people like Settlers, you are published with the same publisher. That's funny, and I do find it funny, just as a total side note, that publisher's name is so hard to say they don't even use it their name as the website name.
I know, it is a name, huh? It's too bad because they're a good publisher. I really like it. But yeah, it's Kersplebedeb, but don't worry, you don't have to remember that.
Yeah, just look up Left Wing books. I actually really like their stuff. There's a couple of other authors that have published with them, like that I have been fond of, but they're mostly known for reprinting Settlers and being impossible to spell. So anyway, thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for your time. I'll put links to your Substack and maybe the publisher's page in the show notes. And you have a good rest of your day. Okay.
You too. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate your time. Yeah. Thanks.
All right.